The girl in the pale pink dress was gathering weeds. Not just a few, plucked from a garden bed, but armful after armful of the big, brittle skeletons of Russian thistle that rolled across the plains. She was 19, her face quiet and unreadable, her movements efficient. Her only companion was a golden retriever with a coat the color of dried prairie grass, who sat and watched, his tail making a slow, rhythmic thump in the dust. Men on horseback slowed their pace to stare. Women, hanging laundry on lines stretched between their sod houses, stopped to whisper behind their hands. They saw a slight Chinese girl, alone on her claim, performing a fool's task. The wind was a constant thief out here, and it had gifted every settler more of these thorny nuisances than they could ever want. They burned them. They cursed them. They kicked them out of the way. They did not build with them. But she did. She piled them high, one against the other, in a growing circle near her half-dug shelter. Her dog, Bao, would occasionally stand, shake the dust from his fur, and nudge her hand with his wet nose before settling again. He was her only audience that didn't judge. The tumbleweed scratched her arms, leaving thin red lines on her skin, but she didn't seem to notice. She worked from sunup until the light began to fail, her pink dress a strange, soft bloom in the harsh brown landscape. The pile grew from a ring to a mound, then a dome, a strange, porous igloo of dead things. If you've ever seen someone do something so contrary to common sense that you can't look away, then you know how those settlers felt. They watched her every day, their curiosity hardening into a kind of pity, then a quiet scorn. What was she thinking? What could she possibly be building? A monument to foolishness, some said. A pyre waiting for a spark, said others. But she just kept working, her hands sure, her expression placid. The pile of weeds was her whole world. Her grandfather had never seen a tumbleweed. He had lived in a place of relentless wind, a high, cold plateau where trees grew stunted and sideways. He taught her not with books, but with his hands. He showed her how the nomads wove grass into thick mats to insulate their yurts, how they packed dried mud and straw into walls that held the day's heat long into the freezing night. He taught her the language of the wind. Not its sound, but its character. A wind from the east carried moisture. A wind from the north carried teeth. A wind that smelled of dust and distance was a liar, promising a clear day while gathering its strength just over the horizon. He taught her that the land always provides what you need to survive on it, but rarely in the form you expect. The strongest tree can be shattered by the storm, he told her, his voice raspy like dry leaves. But the grass, it bends. It yields. It survives. He had shown her how to look at what others discarded. Broken reeds, fallen leaves, loose fibers of wool caught on a thorn bush. All of it had a purpose. Insulation wasn't about hardness, he explained, but about air. The secret to warmth was trapping the air, creating 1,000 tiny pockets of stillness that the cold could not so easily pierce. A solid wall of wood was strong, but it bled heat. A thick wall of something light and airy, something full of nothing? That was a fortress against the cold. She remembered the feel of his calloused hands guiding hers as they wove a small mat from river reeds, the spaces between each stalk just as important as the stalk itself. She was alone now, in a land that looked nothing like his, yet felt just the same. The wind was the same teacher. The principle was the same. The land had given her these weeds, these hollow, intricate skeletons of thorns and stems. They were a gift, a mountain of trapped air waiting to be shaped. And so she gathered them, ignoring the stairs, her grandfather's lessons a quiet hum beneath the ceaseless prairie wind. A man named Jebediah rode over one afternoon, reining in his horse a respectful distance from her work. He was a kind man, his face weathered by the same sun and wind that she endured. He had a wife and a sturdy log cabin on the neighboring claim, a cabin he'd built with pride and sweat. He took off his hat, revealing a pale forehead. "Morning, miss," he said, his voice gentle. She stopped her work, giving him a slight nod. Bao rose to his feet, a low rumble in his chest, but she placed a hand on his head and he fell silent. Jebediah gestured with his hat toward the strange, bristling dome. "Beg Jin your pardon, but what is it you're building there?" He wasn't mocking, not like the others. His curiosity was genuine, laced with a heavy dose of concern. "A house," she said. Just 2 words. Her voice was soft, but clear. Jebediah blinked. He looked from the tumbleweed monstrosity to her small frame, the faded pink of her dress. He cleared his throat. "A house? Well, it's just... Miss, the winter's coming on. That thing, it won't stop the wind. It won't stop the snow. One good gust, and it'll be halfway to Kansas." He was trying to be helpful. He saw a young woman, an outsider, clearly unprepared for the brutality of a plains winter. "We could help you," he offered. "Me and some of the men. We could get a proper soddy up for you in a week. Wool so thick a bull couldn't knock him down." He was offering community. He was offering conventional wisdom. He was offering a lifeline. She looked at her work, then back at him. "Thank you," she said. "This will be warm." Jebediah's face fell into a mask of polite disbelief. He put his hat back on, a slow, final gesture. "All right then," he sighed, the kindness draining from his voice, replaced by resignation. "Suit yourself." He turned his horse and rode away, shaking his head. The story of his offer, and her strange refusal, made its way around the settlement by evening. The whispers grew louder. She wasn't just foolish. She was stubborn. She was proud. And pride, on the prairie, was a dangerous thing to own. The following week, a buggy rattled up to her claim. It was Mr. Abernathy, the land agent from the county seat. He was a man made of straight lines and sharp angles, from his starched collar to the rigid set of his jaw. He did not get out of the buggy. He surveyed the tumbleweed structure with a look of profound distaste. He called out, his voice carrying the weight of officialdom. Lynn straightened from her work, shielding her eyes against the sun. Bow stood beside her, his posture stiff. Mr. Abernathy held a clipboard in his lap. "I am here on behalf of the United States government and the Homestead Act of 1862, he announced, as if she were a public assembly. "This act requires claimants to make improvements upon the land. It specifies the building of a dwelling. A permanent dwelling." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the bristling mound one more time. "That," he said, pointing a stiff finger, "is not a dwelling. It is a fire hazard. It is a public nuisance. It is, to be frank, an eyesore." He made a neat, decisive checkmark on his paper. "You have 30 days to erect a proper structure. 12 by 14 feet, with a door and at least one window. Sod or timber. Those are your options. If a suitable dwelling is not under construction by my next inspection, your claim will be deemed forfeit." He didn't wait for a reply. He clicked his tongue and the horse pulled the buggy in a wide, dusty arc, heading back the way it came. The threat was clear. The official rejection was absolute. The law, like her neighbors, saw only a pile of weeds. It could not see the pockets of air. It could not see the memory of her grandfather's hands. It could not see the deep, quiet wisdom she was trying to build into a home. For a long moment, she just stood there, the agent's dust settling around her. Then she turned back to her work, her movements a little faster now, a little more urgent. The sun was bright. The sky was a brilliant, endless blue. But a new kind of chill had settled over her claim. Have you ever felt a change in the air? Not just a drop in temperature, but a shift in the very quality of the light, the sound, the feel of the world. It began subtly. The wind, which had blown steadily from the south for weeks, died down completely one afternoon, leaving an unnerving silence. The prairie held its breath. Then, a few hours later, it started again, a new wind, a whisper from the north. It didn't bluster, it sliced, thin and sharp as a razor. The sky, once a high, vaulted blue, seemed to lower and flatten, the color draining out of it until it was the flat, metallic gray of a tarnished spoon. The birds disappeared. The usual chatter of sparrows and larks fell silent. The coyotes, who sang their chaotic chorus every evening, were nowhere to be heard. Lynn saw it all. She felt the change on her skin, tasted it in the air. She watched a flock of geese, late in their migration, fly over not in their usual confident V, but in a panicked, disorganized cluster, their calls sounding strained and desperate. Bao felt it too. He grew restless, whining softly and staying close to her side, his nose constantly testing the northern breeze. While her neighbors put the finishing touches on their cabins, chinking the last gaps between the logs with mud and moss, they laughed about the first little cold snap. They chopped more wood, stacking it in neat, satisfying cords against their outer walls. They felt prepared. They felt secure in their solid, respectable homes. Lynn worked with a controlled frenzy. She wasn't just piling the tumbleweeds now. She was weaving them, packing them, using wet mud and grass to create a thick, dense outer shell over the loose, airy core. She worked until her fingers were numb and her shoulders ached, racing against a clock only she could see. The grey sky darkened to the color of a bruise. The northern wind began to moan, a low, sorrowful sound that vibrated in the bones. The cold was no longer just a chill. It was a presence. It had teeth, and it was coming. The snow didn't fall. It attacked. It came not from above, but sideways, a horizontal blizzard of fine, stinging ice crystals driven by a wind that screamed like a dying animal. The world vanished. There was no sky, no ground, only a churning, blinding whiteness. The temperature plummeted, a free fall into a cold so profound it felt like a physical blow. Inside their sturdy log cabins, the settlers huddled by their fireplaces. At first, they were comfortable, smug in their foresight. But the wind was a thief. It found every tiny crack, every poorly chinked seam, and drove needles of icy air deep into their homes. The fires, which had been roaring cheerfully, now had to fight a losing battle against the encroaching frost. The logs burned faster, devoured by the desperate need for heat. A cord of wood meant to last a week was gone in 2 days. Then one. The sound of the wind was a constant, deafening roar, a physical pressure on the walls and eardrums. Inside her tumbleweed igloo, Lynn sat in a strange, muffled quiet. The screaming wind was a distant hum, its fury diffused and broken by the thousands of tangled, interlocking branches. Light filtered through the packed walls, a soft, dim glow that gave the small space a serene, underwater feeling. She had built a small, clay-lined fire pit near the center, with a narrow, cleverly designed chimney that drew the smoke out without letting the wind in. A small fire of dried buffalo chips provided a steady, gentle warmth. It didn't need to roar. It only needed to exist. The trapped air in the walls did the rest. Bao lay curled at her feet, fast asleep, his flank rising and falling in a steady rhythm. There were no drafts. No icy fingers of wind. Frost did not creep down the walls. It was a small, quiet pocket of survival carved from the heart of the storm. While her neighbors watched their woodpiles shrink and the frost thicken on their window panes, Lynn sat in her pink dress, mending a tear in the sleeve, the world outside a forgotten nightmare. The structure groaned. Not a sound of failure, but of settlement, of the immense weight of the snow compacting the outer layers of tumbleweed and mud into a solid, frozen shell. Outside, the blizzard raged into its 3rd day. The wind had scoured the landscape, piling snow into massive drifts, burying fences, wagons, and entire sheds. Inside, the air was still and warm. The temperature held steady, a comfortable buffer against the lethal cold. Lynn had everything she needed. A small store of dried meat and grain, a barrel of melted snow for water, and the quiet companionship of her dog. She moved with an unhurried grace in the confined space, her calmness a stark contrast to the elemental chaos just a few feet away. She checked the walls, running her hands over the packed interior. They were firm, unyielding. The design was perfect. The loose inner core of weeds trapped the warmth from her body and the small fire, while the dense, snow-covered outer shell blocked the wind completely. It was a principle of nature, simple and profound. She thought of Jebediah in his log cabin. She pictured the fire roaring, eating log after log, while the cold seeped in through the solid, unyielding wood. Wood was strong, but it was a poor insulator. It was a conductor. It passed the cold from the outside in, a slow, steady drain on any heat generated within. His house was fighting the cold. Hers was yielding to it, using its own power, the insulating property of snow, to strengthen its defenses. The settlers had built their homes to fight the prairie. She had built hers to cooperate with it. The difference was everything. Bao stirred, lifted his head, and let out a soft whine. His ears perked. He wasn't looking at the entrance. He was looking up, as if he could hear something through the thick, muffled ceiling. Lin paused, listening. But there was nothing. Only the distant, muted howl of the wind, a beast trapped outside her door. Jebediah was freezing. The last of his wood was gone, turned to ash in a desperate, futile battle against the cold. The fire was dead. The inside of his fine, sturdy cabin was now colder than a tomb. Frost coated every surface, thick and white like a shroud. His wife was wrapped in every blanket they owned, her breathing shallow. He could see his own breath, a thick plume of white in the gloom. He had done everything right. He had followed the rules. He had built with solid timber, chinked it tight, and laid in a winter's supply of wood. But the storm was unprecedented, a monster that had broken all the rules. He thought of the girl. The strange Chinese girl in her house of weeds. He'd pitied her. He'd been so sure she would be the first to perish, a frozen little statue in her flimsy pink dress. The irony was a bitter pill. Now she was his only hope. A desperate, foolish, impossible hope. Pulling on his heaviest coat and wrapping a scarf around his face, he plunged out into the white hell. The wind tore at him, stealing his breath. The snow was waist-deep, a thick, sucking powder that fought his every step. He couldn't see more than 3 feet in front of him. He navigated by memory, by sheer will, stumbling toward her claim. It felt like miles. When he finally saw it, he almost didn't recognize it. The structure was a smooth, white dome, a natural hillock in the drifted landscape. A thin tendril of smoke rose from the top, impossibly, cutting a straight line into the churning sky. He fell against the entrance, his frozen hands too numb to knock properly. He scraped at the hide covering the opening. "Hello," he croaked, his voice a dry whisper. "Please?" Help. The hide was pulled aside. A wave of calm, gentle warmth washed over him. The girl stood there, her face illuminated by the soft firelight. She looked at him, her eyes holding no judgment, no triumph. She simply stepped aside, holding the flap open, and let him stumble into the warmth. The storm broke on the 5th day. The wind died, and a weak, watery sun appeared in a sky the color of milk glass. The world was transformed, buried under a silent, immense blanket of white. Doors were dug out. Neighbors checked on neighbors. The toll was heavy. Livestock frozen in their barns. Several families suffering from severe frostbite. 2 cabins had been completely abandoned, their owners seeking shelter with others after their wood ran out. When Jebediah emerged from the Tumbleweed Dome, blinking in the sudden brightness, a group of men digging out a nearby path stopped and stared. They saw him walk, tired but unharmed, away from the very structure they had all mocked. They saw the girl appear in the opening, her pink dress a spot of impossible color in the white landscape. She handed Jebediah a small, steaming bundle wrapped in cloth. He nodded his thanks, his face a mixture of exhaustion and awe, and began the slow trek back to his own claim. Wordlessly, the men watched him go. Then their eyes turned back to the dome. It had survived. More than survived, it had been a sanctuary. While their own log and sod homes had become iceboxes, this pile of weeds had been a haven of warmth. Mr. Abernathy, the land agent, made his rounds a few days later, his buggy replaced by a horse that struggled through the deep drifts. He arrived at Lin's claim expecting to find a ruin or worse. Instead, he found the intact white dome, smoke curling lazily from its peak. He saw her outside, feeding Bao. He saw the structure not as a fire hazard, but as a fortress. He didn't say a word. He just looked at it for a long time, then at her. He tipped his hat, a gesture of respect he had not shown before, turned his horse around, and rode away. The 30-day warning was forgotten. The threat of forfeiture had vanished, buried under 5 feet of snow. In the weeks that followed the Great Blizzard, a strange new industry began on the prairie. Men went out in their wagons not to haul timber or cut sod, but to gather tumbleweeds. They piled them high, no longer laughing. They had seen the proof. They had heard Jebediah's story, told in a quiet, humbled voice around the fire at the general store. They started building smaller versions of Lynn's shelter next to their barns, creating warm, insulated spaces for their precious remaining livestock. They learned to pack the weeds, to use the wet mud and snow to create the hard outer shell. They were clumsy at first, their structures misshapen and lopsided. But they were learning. They were adapting. They were copying the quiet girl they had once dismissed as a fool. Lynn never offered a lesson. She never spoke of her victory or their foolishness. She simply continued her life, her movements as calm and deliberate as ever. When a neighbor, a woman who had once whispered about her behind her back, came to her door and humbly asked, "How do you make it so round?" she didn't lecture. She just picked up a long piece of rope, tied a knot at one end, and showed the woman how to use it as a compass, pivoting around a central point to create a perfect circle. An ancient technique, simple and effective. The land was still hard. The winters were still long. But something had changed. A seed of new wisdom had been planted, brought from a faraway land and proven true in the heart of the storm. The settlers had learned that sometimes the strongest shelter isn't made from the heaviest logs, but from the lightest, most worthless things the wind blows your way. They learned that knowledge doesn't always come from a book or a government agent, but sometimes from a quiet outsider with hands that know how to listen to the land. And in the end, that's the kind of story that sticks with you, isn't it? It's a reminder that what looks like weakness can be a different kind of strength. That the things we throw away, the ideas we mock, the people we overlook, can sometimes hold the very key to our survival. It wasn't about the tumbleweeds, not really. It was about seeing the world differently. It was about recognizing the value in what is humble, what is plentiful, what is free. The settlers wanted to conquer the prairie, to impose their will upon it with axes and saws. Lynn understood that you don't conquer the prairie. You bend with it. You use its gifts. You learn its rhythms and you find your place within them. Her simple pink dress, a soft and yielding garment, was a perfect uniform for her philosophy, so different from the stiff, rugged denim of the other settlers. She didn't have to raise her voice to be heard. The quiet, steady warmth of her home spoke for her, a testament to a wisdom that was older than any log cabin, deeper than any snowdrift. That winter, they didn't just survive. They learned. And that knowledge, passed from one to another, was worth more than any acre of land or cord of wood. It was the kind of wealth that keeps you alive. If you found this story of quiet resilience compelling, consider subscribing for more tales of forgotten history and unsung heroes.